Welcome. Yeah, happy to see a few people here live. We're also going to be recording this and putting it up on our YouTube channel. I'm Richard. I'm co-founder here at Escarpment Labs, and I'm here today to talk about House Ale, which is a new product of ours. Really exciting development, I think, for us in the last year. It actually came out in February, but over the last few months, we've got a lot more brewers using this yeast, trying it out, seeing what it's all about. It's our very first dry yeast, and I'm going to talk all about why we made this decision and what makes this yeast different from some of the other dry yeast options. What makes it, in our opinion, maybe a little bit better than some of the other options out there. And really just try to break down what's the differences between dry yeast and liquid yeast, which is what most of what we offer at Escarpment Labs, as well as just some additional technical information and some ideas for what you can do with House Ale. And yeah, just to reiterate, we're going to talk a little bit. I can't tell you all the secret details of what this strain is, but I can talk a little bit about in general how dry yeast gets made, and also we can talk a little bit about some of the future of where we see yeast going, both in terms of liquid and in dry. Really exciting to be able to offer dry yeast to our customers. It's pretty popular here in Canada, and I know further afield as well. I know we've got a lot of audience down in South America and in Europe, so I'm really looking forward to being able to service you guys better as well, and continue to help people make better beer, make it easier through our yeast and also our knowledge and support. So yeah, we've got dry yeast, we've got liquid yeast. What's the difference? And I think it's important to talk about this because there are some preconceived notions that I think are false, but there are also some important differences to know between these products. Like, it's no longer the case that dry yeast is necessarily inferior in quality. There is very high quality dry yeast out there. You do have to look, and you do get what you pay for, but there is really high quality dry yeast out there. But there are also benefits for liquid yeast, and there are reasons why that's not going to necessarily go away, even as more dry yeast options come onto the market for brewers. So I'm just going to highlight some of the key differences between dry yeast and liquid yeast, because I think it's important to know. When you're making a decision as a brewer, it's useful to know, what are some of the differences between these types of products. So one is selection. So this is a huge barrier for dry yeast. Dry yeast has to be produced, or pretty much has to be produced at a pretty large scale. Like, we're talking more than a ton at a time, more than 1,000 kilograms. And some yeasts can't survive the drying process. It is extra processing. It's extra stress for the yeast, putting it through all of the processing and removing the moisture. So some yeasts just don't survive that process, either in terms of viability, they die, or in terms of performance, they might have sluggish or poor performance in fermentation. So this ability to dry does limit what yeasts can be produced in a dry format. Additionally, a lot of yeasts out there, especially a lot of the yeasts that are made in liquid yeast format, are just too niche, right? Because of those larger batch sizes for dry yeast, it doesn't make sense to make like a super niche saison yeast or Kveik necessarily in a big dry yeast factory. Maybe Kveik is a bit of a edge case because you can make okay dry Kveik at home, but a lot of these yeasts are just too niche to make sense in the dry format until there's quite a lot of demand for them. And you'll see that change over time too. Like, some strains that previously weren't super popular, like London Ale strains, are now the most popular strains for craft beer. So now there's many dry options, for example. So things do change. But that's one of the benefits here of liquid yeast. It's super flexible. Like, I got a picture here that's a batch of yeast grown at 50 milliliters in a flask, which, if you need that much yeast, you can grow it in liquid yeast format. You can just grow a tiny batch, and it's very flexible. We can sell yeast basically from the size of like a homebrew pitch on up to a few hundred hectoliters, because of the scalability of the liquid yeast process. So that's what's really nice about it is you can produce a pretty huge range of yeast fresh and get it to the brewery who needs it or the brewer who needs it um, in peak performance. You can't offer, it's really, really hard to offer dozens and dozens of different strains in a dry format. Like, just for context, at Escarpment, we're making anywhere from 30 to 50 different yeasts every month. Um, that would be really challenging to do on a dry yeast side. Usually the selection of dry yeast options for beer is a lot lower than that. And here's an example. We've even done some experiments in-house, testing out, different methods for drying yeast and how could it be scaled down. And, the answer is that it's a lot harder than it seems at first. You can make the like Kvike style, sheet pan dry yeast, and it'll work okay, but the shelf life is usually not so good on that. It works great with Kvike, but as soon as you try that with normal brewing yeast, it doesn't work so well. So even if you get something like the left-hand side where the yeast viability is quite good, those are nice healthy cells, no staining, no pink staining there. After a few months, it might look like the yeast on the right if it's not dried under extremely controlled conditions. So you start to lose viability, you start to lose quality. You can see those pink stained dead cells. You can see sort of cells breaking apart and a lot more just like junk in there. There's still some living cells, but it's not an easy thing to do. So, one thing that we're upfront about with the house ale is that we do work with a production partner on this. So our dry yeast is made by Lalmond, who's one of the leaders in dry yeast production. We've been able to partner with them and get our yeast made. And I'll have a little bit more information on the sort of professional scaled up dry yeast process later on as well. So what are the other differences between dry yeast and liquid yeast? Flavor is another one to consider. So there's work to be done here, but dry yeasts are reported to be slightly more neutral than their liquid yeast equivalents. There is more scientific work that needs to be done to prove or refute this. There's not a lot of evidence out there. And I think it would be legitimately quite useful to the brewing community to understand this. Like, if you take the exact same strain and ferment a beer with it in dry format versus liquid format, do you actually get different flavors? Because then we could almost think of those as slightly different strains that might have slightly different applications in that case. It does seem like some of the more expressive strains might be muted a little bit in dry format. I've heard that quite a lot, for example, with the Hefeweizen yeast, but that's not always the case. And if you attended our last talk or saw the recap on YouTube, you'll know that there are some ways that you can change the wort conditions to control flavor in a beer like a Hefeweizen or a Belgian ale as well. So there's often ways to compensate for that. I will give the advantage to liquid yeast just because of the selection of yeast out there means that you're going to be able to select a more tailored and a more unique flavor profile, simply because there's just so many different liquid yeast options out there. Fermentation rate. This is kind of interesting. Both dry and liquid yeast, if they're produced to high quality, they can be used to make a successful fermentation with everything you would expect: a short lag time, fast final gravity. For an ale, we want to see it hit final gravity in less than 7 days. That's our target. For a lager, it'll be a little bit longer. Some strains, when they're dried, have an extended lag time. So that is one challenge with drying yeasts. Some of them are more sensitive to that process than others. And usually what you might see that manifest in is in a longer lag time, which might require a higher pitching rate, for example. Luckily for us, the house ale, the ELD1, which is basically our number code for that strain, it doesn't have that issue. In fact, in this trial, I've blanked out some other strains here, but in this trial, the dry actually outperformed the liquid at the same pitch rate, which was quite cool. So some strains, we haven't seen this in all cases. Some strains, when they're dried, they actually lag quite a lot behind the liquid version. But in the case of the house ale, it actually really seems to love the drying process, and it can crush through wort pretty effectively in the dried format, even at the same pitch rate as the liquid strain. So This was one of the things that motivated us to move forward and launch the dry house ale strain. Was it actually, in this case, this strain performed better dry than it did in liquid in this experiment. And across the board, we were getting really good performance from it in the dry format. So that's actually one of the myths is, dry yeast doesn't necessarily ferment worse than liquid yeast. Some strains are really, really compatible with the process. Some are not. It is very strain by strain. We can also look at ease of use between liquid and dry. Our philosophy with Escarpment is to just make things easy across the board. So both can be very easy to use if you've got high quality yeast and it's fresh. Like that's really the most important thing for yeast quality on the liquid side is freshness and making sure that it hasn't gone through too many temperature swings. And then on the dry yeast side is actually very much the same thing. The more you can limit temperature swings, the better in terms of quality. You don't want to let it heat up too much, for example. If you can keep it at fridge temps, it will last a really, really long time. So both can be easy to use. Some dry yeast require rehydration. Some liquid yeast require a starter, especially if it's older. It's not quite as fresh. Getting closer to that use by date. So there are some, in both cases, there are some things that change the ease of use. The nice thing about the ELD1, the house ale, is that it doesn't require rehydration. We did do some experiments on this when we were testing the strain for launch and found basically no difference statistically between a direct pitch and rehydrated yeast. So that's a great step. I know that's been recommended for a lot of different dry brewing yeast, but it makes it really easy. You can just take your yeast and cut open the bag and dump it into your tank. Or if you're home brewing, same thing. Cut it open, dump it into your fermenter, you're good to go. That is true for the liquid yeast when it's fresh as well, though. So either way, it's pretty easy to use. Cost. This is an interesting one because it's not necessarily fully straightforward, right? The big wrinkle here is that yeast can be reused, and that changes the cost of yeast, whether it's liquid or whether it's dry. If you're not repitching, which means reusing the yeast, dry yeast is objectively a better value because it tends to be priced lower than some of the premium liquid yeast strains, and that includes some of the highest quality dry yeast options. But if you're repitching, you can really make liquid yeast pay off pretty quickly in a few generations. For most strains, liquid yeast does repitch better, although we have heard of repitching dry yeast, including house ale, more than 10 times. So your mileage may vary there. What we found internally and through some trials with brewing partners is that this strain does repitch reliably up to 4 generations, and there have been positive reports beyond that. I think in a lot of cases, looking at the cost structure, you really don't need to repitch more than that on a dry strain, and even if you're at 2 or 3 generations, you're at the break-even point against some of the lower cost dry yeast options that might not offer some of the same benefits in terms of performance. And we're going to get into that as well and show you where some of the potential efficiency benefits are over some of the other options out there. And just one sort of take home here is, one is not necessarily cheaper than another, right? If you're taking a premium liquid strain and repitching it 20 times, your actual cost is going to be lower than if you're pitching a brick of dry yeast and not repitching at all, right? So it comes down to the cost of the risk of repitching and seeing changes in how that yeast performs in terms of flavor. It comes down to efficiency, right? If yeast is repitched but doesn't get proper nutrition, you can get batches with off flavors or stalled ferments. On the other hand, if yeast is treated really well and gets the nutrients it needs, it isn't held for too long in between fermentations, you can actually get more efficient ferments, right? So you kind of get out what you put in with repitching, and that is true for dry yeast as well. One thing I'll mention for repitching dry yeast is You can be a little flexible with oxygen on that first pitch if you're putting in a fresh brick of dry yeast, because the dry yeast does have some built-in sterols. It doesn't require as much oxygen compared to a liquid yeast pitch. When you're repitching, it's basically liquid yeast at that point. So you have to make sure that it has oxygen. And in both cases, you have to make sure that it has adequate nutrition. So making sure that your wort has enough free amino nitrogen, making sure you've got zinc in there, micronutrients, all that good stuff. It's going to pay off in terms of quality beer. And it's going to, if you're looking to repitch to reduce costs, it's going to help you there as well. We've been able to do some commercial trials. So here's some data here. We had a brewery partner do some trials at a 20 hectoliter scale, so 2,000 liters, comparing this strain with another dry yeast option, just because they were curious, right? They were looking at, does it make sense to try our strain versus what they had been using, and what would the analytical numbers tell us? What are some of the potential benefits? And I thought this was really quite a useful trial because they were able to use the exact same wort, 40 hectoliters, split it between two fermenters, and measure exactly what differences they get with the house ale versus a strain that's been on the market for quite a while. And I think the results are quite interesting. So it did produce a slightly drier beer. That is one thing that I will say, as well as the feedback I've gotten about this strain, is that it does crush through wort. It does produce a pretty dry beer. For a clean ale strain, it is pretty high attenuation. So if you like your beers dry, that's great. If you want a little bit more residual sweetness, you may need to make some slight adjustments in how you mash, for example, to match what you might be using previously. And it's also a great strain, if you're worried about hop creep, because of the high attenuation, it's going to have less risk of that. It's going to be able to get through any hop creep you get in your, especially like West Coast IPAs. It's a great strain for that. So I think that that's actually a potential benefit here. Pretty close in terms of our actual ABV and our pH. This strain does reduce BUs, bittering, a little bit more than some strains. It's not extreme. It's just some strains are more than others. You actually can see a swing. If you're looking at we did this experiment a few years ago. If you start with a 35 IBU base, the measurable IBUs of the finished beer, depending on the yeast strain you use, will be anywhere from 20 to 35. Like some strains can actually strip out a lot of bitterness from the beer. We do have that data on our knowledge base if you're curious to check that out, because it can have an impact on flavor perception, right? This beer might be perceived as a little bit less bitter, so there might be a need to adjust the bittering slightly. And one thing that I was really excited about, because I can't taste it very well, and I'm always worried that I'm going to serve someone a beer that's riddled with diacetyl, and I can't taste it, is the strain is a really low diacetyl producer compared to some of the other options out there. It cleans it up pretty well. It's not to say that there's not no diacetyl. You still have to treat the fermentation properly, make sure that the beer gets a diacetyl rest, all that good stuff. But when the house ale was compared to a different dry yeast, it did have measurably much lower diacetyl content. So in this case, about 4 times lower diacetyl. And I believe this was at 7 days. So really, really nice to have a beer that's finished fermentation and clear diacetyl at 7 days on the commercial side. I think that's something that would help a lot of breweries with process improvement and being able to make clean beer reliably and quickly and get a little bit more efficiency out. So that's really exciting, especially for someone like me. I'm not very sensitive to diacetyl, so knowing that it's below that sensory threshold is really comforting in this case. What can you use it for? You can use it for a lot of things. Like this was intended, the reason that we selected this strain for the house ale was we wanted something that could serve as many purposes as possible. It's kind of like our all-purpose yeast. And actually, that was one of the original sort of ideas for this project. What could we come up with that would serve as many purposes as possible to introduce people to dry yeast from Escarpment Labs, and then maybe we can take it from there and come up with some other options. So you can use this thing for a lot of different beers. It's a great platform to showcase your other ingredients. It's a great platform to make clean, crushable beers, whether you're home brewing and you want to make a clean and crushable beer fast, whether you're brewing commercially and you're just looking for something that just works and keeps the taps flowing with your blonde ales. It's awesome for that. We think it works really good for hoppy beers too, especially when you look at sort of the West Coast side of things. The strain does have some similar traits to American ale strains that are traditionally used for like West Coast hoppy beers, where you're accentuating some of those hop aromatics. You're sort of letting producing a dry beer and letting those hops shine. Works really well. So definitely a top strain for pale ale, West Coast IPA. It can be used for hazy beers. You do need to watch the mashing. If you want something that's relatively sweet, then you have to mash appropriately. But if you're looking to make a hazy beer that is sort of really letting the hops shine, it's a good option, because some of the other hazy strains out there will produce a lot of their own flavor, like yeast esters. It all comes down to your own preferences. We have been able to produce nice hazy beer in-house with this strain. It's not nearly as haze positive as something like Foggy London, where it's almost like a cheat code for haze. It just kind of works. But it certainly can work. But as we see the trends shift more back towards cleaner, clearer beers, like if I were to say what the two big trends are this year, it would be Kolsch and West Coast IPA in terms of the brewers I'm talking to, which is not what I would have guessed, but it's kind of awesome to see. So just know that the yeast is going to be really good for a lot of those clean styles, and can pinch in some other places. Another place where it shines really well is in malty beers and stouts. It really, because the yeast is so neutral, can let a lot of your specialty ingredients shine. So one place where we've had a ton of really good success with this strain is in, maybe not the most commercially viable beer, English milds. We've made some really good English milds in-house with this strain. Same thing goes for stouts. You can go high gravity, you can do imperial stouts. A lot of options there that really let those other ingredients shine. And it's actually kind of nice to make, some of those maltier session beers, some of those darker session beers. You can still get a nice malty, profile without it being super sweet or high residual sugar. Definitely worth playing around with. Pretty much for anything that we would consider clean, right? It's not going to make your like Belgian triple, but there's yeast out there for that. Use those. Dark mild, yeah. How does it compare to other strains? I can't go out here and fire shots directly at other yeast brands, but I can show some data comparing. So this is a trial where we got fresh pack of our house ale, and also as fresh packs as we could possibly get of some of the other options out there for what I would call like a clean, dry strain for beer. And we basically put them in the same conditions, same pitch rate, same wort, and saw how they did in terms of fermentation rate. So one thing that stood out here for us was that we did see a really nice combination of both the fermentation rate as well as the degree of fermentation, the attenuation. So it's kind of hard to see the end point of this fermentation curve, but the red strain and the house ale in green finished at pretty much the same final gravity, but the house ale was done a lot faster. It was nearly at final gravity at day 3, where it took till day 6 for the other strain to get there. And then the blue strain finished at a higher finishing gravity. So depending on your target, that might be good. I know, it's nice to get a little bit more efficiency out of the yeast, and you can always adjust your final gravity or your attenuation with how you mash. So it's nice to see that combination. We like it a lot, being able to turn around a beer pretty fast and have a pretty predictable and high attenuation here. So seems to stack up pretty well. I think our yeast production partners have done a really good job here. Another thing that's really cool is the temperature flexibility. So some yeast strains respond really aggressively to temperature, in the sense that at cold temperatures, they might just do absolutely nothing. And at higher temperatures, they might ferment super fast and make a lot of off flavors like fusels because they've just fermented so fast. Um, what's really cool about this strain, and another reason why we selected this strain background for house ale, was it has a really wide temperature range, even beyond what we show here, which is 16 to 20 Celsius. You can use a pretty wide range to ferment it with, and it responds pretty similarly. So that's really beneficial, especially if you know, in situations where you don't have temperature control, like home brewing. Although I know a lot of home brewers are like upgrading more and have fancier and fancier equipment. Being able to get a consistent fermentation between like 16, 20 Celsius, 22 is really, really beneficial, I think, on the home brewing side. And even on the professional brewing side as well. The strain does express flavors a little bit differently at different temperatures. So you can get a cleaner profile at the colder temperatures. I really liked some like West Coast IPAs fermented pretty cold, you know, at the 16, 17 C range. And it's quite efficient fermenting. You can also push the temperature up. So, you know, up at 22, 24 C, especially if you underpitch, you can get more esters. So doing some more dual duty and pushing a little bit of esters in some of those beer styles that might benefit from it, like an English mild, stout, porter, or American stout, whatever you want to do. You get a little bit more esters by pushing the temperature as well. So that's another benefit. You can really use one yeast to do a lot of different things. Just want to highlight pitch rate. So the pitch rate we recommend is actually lower than some of the recommendations out there. And the goal there is because it is a fairly premium dry yeast. We just want to ensure that the value is there for brewers and that you know, you're able to make the numbers work, whether it's home brewing or pro brewing. So we do typically recommend a pitch rate of 0.5 grams per liter. So that would be one of these bricks in 10 hectoliters. Although if you want a faster fermentation, you will get a faster fermentation through higher pitch rate. We've found some brewers are going with higher pitch rates, some are going with lower. It all does depend on the beer that's being made, the brewery processes. But in general, we found that this is a really good starting point. And another thing to highlight is that's just one homebrew sachet for your standard sized homebrew batch, 20 liters or 5 gallons. I know, you know, some people will pitch two sachets into a homebrew batch, and I think the pricing has gone up for pretty much everything on the homebrew side. So it's nice to be able to pitch one. And then my other suggestion would be collect a bit of that yeast, reuse it. Even if you're just collecting a bit of yeast from your first batch, save it in the fridge in a mason jar and pitch that into your next batch. You've already saved some money, and it's a really good yeast for repitching. So that's another way to you know, save on some of your costs. I know that's top of mind right now, so it's important to keep those things in mind. If you are doing a higher gravity brew, that is where we suggest a higher pitch rate. So these are pretty wide ranges, but if you're doing a higher gravity brew, like I would say, if you're up at 1065, 17 Plato, you can probably get away with, you know, the standard pitch rate. But if you're going higher into sort of the imperial territory, you should bump up the pitch rate. You're going to get a faster, cleaner fermentation. It's not a super high fusel alcohol producing strain, but there's still always that risk if you're under pitching a high gravity beer. And, you know, but because this yeast can go pretty high, you know, you can use it for imperial stouts. I did hear from one client who was using it in their 13% alcohol imperial stouts and said it's absolutely ripping. But you do want to make sure that you're using a good pitch rate for that. But that's great. That's also convenient. You don't have to worry about like making a beer to crop a ton of yeast to go into your imperial stout and hope that it's happy. You can just direct pitch the dry strain, and it works really, really well for those high ABV beers. So what else can you do with it? I mean, it's not going to do everything. Like I said, it's not going to make your Belgian triple. It's not going to walk your dog. You still got to do that, but it can do a lot for you. And that's why we're excited about this yeast and having it fit in with our lineup of liquid yeasts and our nutrients and everything else we offer. There's other things you can do with it. So one great option is restarting stuck ferments. liquid yeasts aren't the best option for restarting stuck ferments because they tend to benefit from oxygenation, and you don't want to oxygenate a beer that's like halfway through fermentation usually, because of the risk of oxidation. So for that reason, because dry yeast um, tends to be enriched in sterols, which at least for one generation can kind of sub out for oxygenation, you can pitch a dry strain and it's usually going to have a better chance of success finishing out that beer in a stuck fermentation situation. The other option you have there is what's called krausening, which is where you take yeast that's basically just in the lag phase, like or sorry, in the log phase, like actively fermenting in your beer, and you pitch that into your stuck ferment. But that obviously requires quite a lot of timing, right? And if you don't have the yeast, the right yeast on hand to krausen with, then you're kind of out of luck. So that's a great application. Strain can also be used for bottle, cask, or keg conditioning, any secondary conditioning of beer. It's a great option because it is clean and fast. I wouldn't recommend it. The caveat is I wouldn't recommend it for highly acidic beers. I do think that the some of the wine strains, like the champagne style strains, are a better option there for really acidic beers because those yeasts are quite tolerant of the acidity. But for a standard beer and even a sour beer that's not like ripping acidic, like not not super low pH, super high acid, it will work. And the nice thing is that it's relatively clean. It's not going to change the flavor profile of whatever it's re-fermenting too much. And you can use a really low pitch rate for bottle conditioning. So you can use basically a tenth or a fifth of what you would normally use. We talked a little bit about high gravity brewing, but then that's another strength. So the strain is decently alcohol tolerant. We've heard of good results out in the field of making high grav stouts with this strain. So that's another option because I know that picking up liquid yeast at the pitch rate required for high grav stouts does get pretty expensive, and maybe you can use this and save the money on vanilla, which isn't getting less expensive, I don't think. So that's an option. And then also cider. We've been playing around with this pretty recently as we sort of gear up for the fall. But the strain does quite well in cider. A lot of beer strains actually do a great job of fermenting cider. The challenge with cider is that it's low nutrient. So as long as you supply enough nutrient, you can get a lot of different yeast to ferment out a cider and make really nice results. This strain is really clean. It produced a pretty nice cider when we tested it. We did make sure to include some both bulk nitrogen, so some diammonium phosphate, as well as yeast lightning, which is our nutrient that, in addition to beer, works great in ciders and seltzers and all sorts of things because it's providing really good complex nutrition for the yeast that helps to ensure that it makes a clean ferment. Not super sulfury, anything like that. Like I would say this cider, like we didn't drink it after 10 days, but it was pretty much ready to go. You could keg it and drink it that fast, which is pretty quick for a cider. So the question that I get the most that I haven't answered yet is, what is it? And I can't say exactly, unfortunately, but I can give you some hints. I can give you some information to help you. So genetically, this is an English strain. We position it like an American strain. The strain presents like an American strain. It is clean. It is neutral. It is highly attenuative. It's not insanely flocculent like some of the English strains are either. So that's another, I think, benefit, because some of those super flocculent yeasts are just like, it's like handling peanut butter. It's a huge pain. This strain is solidly medium flocculation, which makes it really easy to harvest and repitch and all of that. But it's kind of interesting because genetically this is an English strain. There's no contest. When we look at the genome sequencing, it's an English strain. It's not super estery. Some of the English strains do push a lot of esters in their flavor profile. It's not that. It's a little bit more neutral. You can push some esters with the higher temperatures, lower pitch rates, but in general, it's not like a super heavy flavor producer. And it is genetically distinct from other dry yeast. So we haven't taken a different dry yeast and repackaged. It's a unique strain based on a strain that was in our liquid yeast catalog that we always thought was basically the underdog, and we wanted to give it a better platform to succeed in beer, and I think we have because it seems really really happy in the place that it's in. Just want to share a little bit of information about how dry yeast is made because I think it's really cool. Um, you can also check out some videos. There's a lot of YouTube videos about this. It's an industrial process that's been heavily automated. A lot of different places around the world, so you can watch videos of like equipment manufacturers showing like how all these steps happen, and it's really really cool. I think it's a little bit more visual than liquid yeast production, where like we pump air into a tank and then harvest off slurry. Um, but it actually starts very much the same way. So making dry yeast isn't all that different from making liquid yeast. You're still, starting a small amount of yeast in a big tank of liquid media and letting that grow so that you have um, finished cells at the end of the process. Then there's just some added steps to produce the dry yeast. So concentrating it, so producing a slurry, no different from liquid yeast. Then there's the extra steps where it actually becomes dry yeast. I think it's cool. You can also look up the videos on YouTube. The first step is you're basically taking slurry and you're removing moisture from that slurry to produce basically like a yeast paste. This is also what can be used to make like a yeast cake. If you've ever seen like the fresh yeast in the grocery store, when it comes in like the little brick that looks like butter or something like that. Slightly different processes. You might see a drum filter used, which is that thing I show on the top, where you have slurry being concentrated on the edge of that filter and coming off the bottom with like a scraper. And then, or you might have a filter press, which is basically taking that like a yeast slurry and concentrating the yeast using filters, using just straight pressure that way. And then what they'll do is they'll take that concentrated yeast that's now kind of semi-solid, and they're going to extrude it. This is my favorite step to see. I've seen dry yeast extruding in person once, and I think I had to be like pulled away just because I think it's really, really fun to watch. But they basically push the yeast through a really fine die extruder. So it makes yeast spaghetti, is how I've heard it described. I stole that phrase from Tobias at Lalmond. That's not mine, but it's basically how it's done. They make these little yeast noodles. It goes onto a conveyor belt and kind of gets shaken up. And this, I think this is true for pretty much all dry yeast manufacturing. And then they dry it. So the common way to do that is a fluid bed dryer. And so the way that works is you have those little bits of dry yeast, the yeast spaghetti going into this dryer. There's a bunch of hot, dry air being pushed up or circulated one way or another in this thing. It's producing a bunch of basically like surrounding those particles, making them bounce around. And when they hit a certain weight, you might have those dry particles be ejected out the other side. So you can almost think of it like kind of like how a popcorn popper works too, whereas when the particles change their density, they leave the thing so they don't keep getting cooked. So these are obviously super dialed in dry yeast production plants. Everything's dialed in to make sure that the yeast maintains its quality. Like this is a lot of processing, a lot of extra steps, shear forces, heating, all this stuff. So it is a lot of challenge. So, it is a testament to some of the skill sets of dry yeast production that they're able to take relatively wimpy yeasts like brewing yeast. Bread yeast is like no problem, by the way. Brewing strains can be a little bit more challenging. They're able to dial in the process and produce a high quality, viable dry brewing strain through this kind of process. So every plant does it, to my knowledge, does it a little bit differently, but this is sort of the basic overview of how dry yeast gets made. And really the key thing here is it starts very similarly to how liquid yeast works, but there's these extra steps that produce the dry yeast. So because there's extra steps, that does increase risk of poor quality, right? Yeast just going through that extra stress. It also increases the risk of contamination. So especially when we're looking at beer, where First of all, beer is super sensitive to contamination. Second of all, breweries reuse yeast. So that's another way that a contaminant can rapidly multiply and ruin your day in a brewery or even home brewing. The smallest contaminant can cause a really big problem after a few generations. So that's one of the biggest challenges with dry yeast. And so it does mean that if you're producing, dry yeast at scale or really at any scale, you really need to do your quality control. You really need to check and screen both in terms of performance as well as in terms of purity. You need to make sure that it's not cross-contaminated with different yeast strains. You need to make sure that it's not contaminated with bacteria or molds or anything like that. So dry yeast does have to get screened quite heavily. It is a quite in-depth quality control process. And you do see different levels of screening happening. And that is also part of the price with any yeast, but that includes dry yeast. If you're paying a higher price, usually it means that there's a lot of quality control work going into it to make sure that it's going to give you the results that you're looking for. Okay, so where can I find it? Hopefully this gave you some information about the house sale and about just dry yeast versus liquid yeast in general. If you're a pro brewery, pretty much anywhere. Right now, you can get that directly from us. We might look at other ways to distribute it in the future, but right now we can ship direct to many places. So if you're curious, you can always reach out. On the homebrew side, if you're in Canada, you can order it directly from us. We'll ship it to you, or your local homebrew shop. We work with a majority of homebrew shops across Canada and love to support them. And I think they were excited to hear that we would have a product that has a longer expiration date, because managing liquid yeast as a homebrew shop is a challenge. So if you're a home brewer, also make sure that you support your local homebrew shop. And if you have the ability to make a yeast starter, then don't be afraid of the slightly older pitches. In a lot of cases, it's still high quality, and a yeast starter will wake it up, no problem. But the nice thing with dry yeast is that we get a much longer window. Like you get, depending on the strain, between 2 and 3 years. If you're in the US, Great Fermentations has been a great partner for us. We also have a few more local homebrew shops coming on board in the US, so our availability is getting better in the US. So that's another option. Same thing in Europe. I know that this is available from Hembryggeriet in Sweden, and I think that there's possibly some other shops that are able to stock this strain as well. So you can always ask if it's not in stock. Make sure that they bring it in for you. Just want to make sure that we get this into people's hands and that they have this option. If you want to learn more, I know that this talk has been very centered on one product. But if you want to learn more about yeast and fermentation in general, just want to plug our knowledge base. This has been something we've been working on for almost the last 2 years. It was launched last April, but just starting to put together as much of our resources as possible so that you have a place where you can find information about fermentation, about beer, about yeast, make the best decisions possible. So like even I talked about earlier about, different yeasts reduce bitterness more than others. That data is on there. It's just there waiting for you. So you can find some cool stuff. Of course, we have our blog and our YouTube as well. Before we head to Q&A, I also just wanted to highlight we have a few more upcoming webinars. I know this one was very focused on the house sale, the dry yeast. Really excited to talk about that because we have got a lot of questions, and I hope I was able to answer a lot of those through this discussion. But if you're interested in Brettanomyces, make sure you're tuning in next Monday. I'm going to be talking about Brett science. There's been a lot of cool Brett research in the last few years, basically, since before COVID, that we can update you on. Some stuff that we've done internally to try to figure out, I should say, how to make Brett ferment faster or more reliably. And maybe we'll discover why that's a futile effort. A lot of other interesting stuff too. Just sort of summarize some of the research that's been done. I love Brett. Brett's a flavor powerhouse. It's really cool. Obviously not the easiest or fastest yeast out there, but it's a great option to have in your arsenal, and I hope that everyone remains interested in Brett beers. We're also going to be talking about beer yeast nutrition the following week. So a deep dive into yeast nutrition, talk about all the things that yeast needs. There's a lot to cover there. We're going to try to break it down and make it as useful as possible, because it's not just free amino nitrogen. Yeast nutrition is really complex. I think I've spent the last 12 years learning this topic, and I think there's still a lot more to learn. So hope to pass along some of that information. And then just to highlight a few more, we got a bunch of these lined up. We're going to be talking about non-alcoholic beers. So really hot topic, especially this past year. Some of the fastest growing breweries out there are focused on non-alcoholic beers. I'm going to talk about some of the easy ways to get started on non-alcoholic beer production. We're also going to be talking about beer off flavors, controlling beer off flavors. And you might see some of this content rolling out on our blog quite soon. So my partner, Nate Ferguson, who you may have seen before from webinars and YouTube, he's launching a blog series on off flavors. We have some of that on the knowledge base already. We'll be doing a video version as well, just try to make it as easy as possible to understand how to control beer off flavors. Make sure that you're not serving someone a beer that's got, acetaldehyde or diacetyl or fusels in it as much as possible. We want people tasting good craft beer and good homebrew. And then finally, wrapping up this series, we're going to be talking about using beer yeast in cider, seltzer, sake, wine, and mead. Basically, using beer yeast everywhere that's not beer, because we've been doing a lot of experimentation the last few years with our brewing strains, and we find time and time again, there's some really interesting ways to apply brewing yeast in other beverages that you wouldn't normally think of. So we'll be challenging some conventional wisdom, challenging some traditions there as well. So make sure you stay tuned for that. That's wrapping up on September 18th. So hope to see the rest of you or all of you as we proceed through this series. You can always check out the recaps on YouTube as well. And if you're a home brewer, professional brewer working with us, then thank you for your support. And if you're interested, you can always reach out to us. We'll figure out how we can help you out. I'm going to move on to a Q&A. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I see 2 questions already, which is awesome. So thank you for submitting the questions in the Q&A box. I see it on the right-hand side of my screen. If you do have a question, you can type one in there. Okay, so let's go with Evan's question first. So Evan asks, you mentioned that D1, ELD1 is related to one of your liquid yeasts. Is it the same genetically as one of your liquids, or is it something similar to the forced adaptation of something like crispy? That is a good question. Yeah, so I did talk about this in the slides briefly, but just to expand a little bit, we have strains that in our bank that are that we think are really good, but are not necessarily like super popular commercial products. In this case, the strain did have some. It was available commercially. It is still off and on available as a liquid strain. But in this case, we selected a strain that we thought was really, really good. It met the specs of what we thought brewers were looking for. It's not necessarily the most conventional. Like the most conventional thing to do would be to take our Cali ale and dry it. But there's a lot of different options for a dry California ale already on the market. So we thought, okay, let's find something that's similar in terms of flavor profile, similar in terms of, or maybe even better in terms of fermentation kinetics, and see if that will work. So I actually just have a copy of our yeast flavor biotransformation guide. You can actually see we're able to get the house ale in this. It actually is, closest to the Cali. You probably can't see that very well. Probably is closest to the Cali ale in terms of its overall flavor profile, but offers some benefits in terms of fermentation. You can download this online, by the way, the yeast flavor and biotransformation guide. There's a lot of useful information in there for designing your beers. So it's like an underdog strain, is basically long story cut short. We're definitely not opposed to using forced adaptation, lab evolution to develop strains. And certainly, any strain that we're developing moving forward, we're going to assess, does this make sense in a liquid format? Does this make sense in a dry format? Does it make sense to go liquid then dry? We're going to sort of keep our minds open there. Okay, we got one more question here. Based off the information you provided, this yeast sounds like it has some overlap with Sterling. Would you say Sterling is the most similar liquid yeast strain in Escarpment's catalog to the dry house ale yeast? Similar for sure. I don't see it listed at Great Fermentations. This is from Brent. Do you have an ETA when they will have it up? Well, I guess you have to ask them to pick it up then. I know that they've done an order with us recently. They've been offering some of our unique strains like Thio Libre and Hydra. Hopefully they're interested in placing another order soon, because I know that they're sold out of at least one of those strains. So perhaps they can be encouraged by some customers to pick up some sachets of the house ale, right? It's at a good price point, competitive price point, great shelf life, all that good stuff. So I think, Brent, if you can encourage them to pick up some sachets of the house ale, then they'll be able to help you out. Okay. Any other questions before we wrap this up? And also keep in mind, if you're interested in any of the other webinars, you can go in, make sure you sign up, and you can actually ask your questions in advance as well. I do go in and check for those things. It's useful, when I'm putting together these presentations too. I can go in and check for the questions and just make sure that those are answered ahead of time. So super, super helpful to make sure that you're getting the information that you need. If there isn't much else, then I think what we'll do is we will sign off. And I just want to say thanks for tuning in and listening to some of this information about the house ale dry strain. It's really, really exciting to be able to offer dry yeast. In addition to the other benefits, it's a lot easier to ship, lower cost for shipping. We can go further and wider. So we actually can. My hope is that we can start working with some of the folks who have been engaging with our webinars and our knowledge in places that we really are struggling to ship liquid yeast to, like South America is a great example, Australia, all those places. I'm looking forward to working with you. Cheers. Thanks, everyone.